It started with a hymn, a moment of peace and faith. But within minutes, that calm would turn into chaos, and a small church in Odessa, Texas, would never be the same. What makes a man walk into a place of worship and open fire, turning a sanctuary into a battlefield? Today, we explore the terrifying events of the Odessa Church murders, events that shook a community and left behind a trail of blood and unanswered questions. A quiet morning shattered. It was supposed to be another peaceful Sunday morning in Odessa, Texas. The first church of Odessa was filled with the usual congregants' families, elderly couples, and children. The atmosphere was serene as the choir softly hummed a hymn. But this sense of tranquility would be shattered in an instant, and what was meant to be a gathering of faith and community would transform into a scene of terror. At first, the sharp sound was mistaken for something outside a car backfiring, perhaps. But then the church doors flew open with a force that silenced the entire congregation. What they saw next froze them in place. A man, armed with a rifle, stepped inside, his expression void of emotion. Without a word, he raised his weapon and fired. The crack of gunfire filled the sanctuary, followed by a wave of screams as chaos erupted. People scrambled to the ground, diving for cover, praying for a way out of the nightmare that had just begun. The man responsible for this unspeakable tragedy was Seth Ader, a figure known to some in Odessa, but for all the wrong reasons. Ader was a drifter in life, a man whose instability had been visible long before that fateful day. Those who encountered him described him as erratic, often simmering with rage just beneath the surface. He struggled to hold down jobs and had a string of failed relationships that seemed to fuel his growing isolation. Ader had a history with law enforcement, although none of it pointed to what he would become. He'd had minor run-ins with the law, complaints from neighbors about his erratic behavior, and incidents that painted a picture of a man teetering on the edge of control. At times, his anger would boil over in fits of aggression, but then he would retreat back into the shadows, only to resurface in unpredictable ways. But nothing about Seth Ader's troubled past hinted at the monstrous act he would unleash on Odessa that morning. His downward spiral had been slow and mostly unnoticed until that Sunday. His mind, seemingly consumed by anger and delusion, led him to believe that the world was against him. And that day, with a rifle in his hand and a heart filled with hate, he decided to strike back. But the church wasn't the beginning of his rampage. It was merely one stop on a far darker journey. Hours before stepping into the church, Seth Ader had already begun his rampage. Behind the wheel of his car, he drove through the streets of Odessa with no clear direction, only a deadly purpose. His vehicle became a moving weapon as he fired indiscriminately at anyone in his path. Pedestrians were struck down as they walked along quiet streets, while drivers found themselves caught in a hail of bullets, unaware of where the shots were coming from. The city, once peaceful, had transformed into a hunting ground, with Ader at the center of the carnage. Panic spread as the sound of gunfire echoed across Odessa. Calls flooded the police department, each one describing a scene of terror, a car swerving recklessly, a man shooting at random, leaving bodies in his wake. Police were in pursuit, but Ader was quick, unpredictable, and seemingly without motive. He slipped through their grasp again and again, his movements erratic and his intentions impossible to predict. Each time they thought they had him cornered, he would appear somewhere else, firing his weapon, leaving more victims behind. For the residents of Odessa, there was no warning, no explanation. One moment, life was normal. The next, it was filled with horror as Ader's senseless violence spiraled out of control. And yet, the worst was still to come. What had once been a sacred space of peace and prayer was now unrecognizable. The sanctuary, filled with the sound of hymns moments earlier, was now a scene of unspeakable carnage. The pews, which had offered comfort to the faithful, were now littered with the wounded and lifeless. Seth Ader moved through the church with chilling precision, his rifle never lowering as he unleashed round after round of gunfire. Screams of terror filled the air as congregants tried to make sense of the chaos, their shock quickly giving way to survival instincts. Some ducked behind pews, clutching loved ones, while others were too stunned to move. But in the midst of the horror, acts of extraordinary bravery emerged. A father threw himself in front of his children, shielding them from the deadly barrage. A woman wrapped her arms around an elderly couple, refusing to let go even as the gunfire roared around her. These moments of selfless courage, born out of love and desperation, would forever mark this day in Odessa's history. Yet, even as the violence escalated, there were those who believed they could survive. Hope flickered in the hearts of the terrified, even in the face of unimaginable horror. The bravery of a few, standing between their loved ones and death itself, became a symbol of defiance and unwillingness to surrender to the evil that had entered their sanctuary. But for many, that hope was fleeting, as Ader continued his deadly path through the church, leaving devastation behind him. Emergency services arrived swiftly, but the chaos was already overwhelming. Odessa's law enforcement and medical teams had been stretched to their limit, chasing the violence that had erupted across the city. The reports of gunfire weren't confined to one place. It was as though terror itself had spread through the streets. By the time they reached the church, the scene they faced was beyond anything they could have prepared for. First responders entering the sanctuary were confronted with the aftermath of pure horror. Bloodied pews, shattered windows, and personal belongings scattered across the floor told the story of the chaos that had just unfolded. The once lively church was now eerily silent, except for the low cries of the wounded and the echo of sirens outside. The acrid smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, a grim reminder of the violence that had taken place. Medics worked quickly, tending to the wounded, their hands steady despite the devastation around them. Law enforcement moved through the building, checking for survivors, securing the area, and piecing together what had just happened. The gravity of the scene hit hard. The church, a place of sanctuary, had become a battlefield. The gunman was still out there, and with every second that passed, the urgency to stop him only grew. As police struggled to comprehend the devastation inside the church, the nightmare outside continued to unravel. Reports flooded in from every corner of Odessa, more shootings, more bloodshed. Seth Ader wasn't finished. It felt as though he was everywhere at once, a phantom leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. Law enforcement was chasing shadows, unsure of where he would strike next, but the reports painted a terrifying picture. Witnesses described seeing Ader speeding through the streets, driving erratically, his rifle sticking out of his car window. His targets seemed random pedestrians walking along sidewalks, drivers in their vehicles, anyone who happened to cross his path. In some cases, he appeared to aim deliberately, picking out his victims with chilling precision. In others, the shots were wild, indiscriminate, as if chaos itself had taken control. Odessa, a town not accustomed to such violence, was now under siege. Fear gripped the city as residents locked their doors and huddled indoors, unsure if they would be next. The roads that once carried the rhythm of daily life now became paths of destruction. With every passing minute, the urgency to stop Ader grew, but he was elusive, vanishing into the streets, only to reappear moments later, gunfire erupting in his wake. Law enforcement was in a frantic race against time. Tracking Seth Ader's movements was proving to be a near impossible task. His unpredictable behavior made him a ghost on the streets of Odessa, appearing one moment, disappearing the next. With each report of gunfire, the urgency grew, and the scale of the response expanded. Multiple agencies quickly joined the hunt, coordinating efforts to bring his rampage to an end. Roadblocks were set up across the city, patrols increased, helicopters circled overhead, all in a desperate attempt to corner him. But Ader seemed to slip through every crack. His car was a moving weapon, and the randomness of his attacks made it impossible to predict where he would strike next. Just when law enforcement thought they had him pinned down, he would resurface in another part of town, leaving fresh victims in his wake. Each near miss fueled the frustration of the officers trying to stop him, knowing that as long as he remained free, the body count would only rise. Odessa had become a battlefield, and Aether was its invisible menace. Time was running out, and with each passing moment, the situation grew more desperate. Inside the Odessa Church, the survivors were left to grapple with the unthinkable. The gunfire had stopped, but the aftermath of the massacre lingered in every corner of the sanctuary. Blood stained the pews, shattered glass glistened on the floor, and the haunting silence was broken only by the cries of the injured and the sobs of those who had lost someone they loved. For many, the physical wounds were severe, and ambulances quickly rushed them to hospitals. But for others, the day would claim them before help could arrive. The emotional toll was far greater. Survivors, shaken and broken, struggled to make sense of what had happened, replaying the horrifying moments in their minds. Families who had come together that morning to worship were now divided by grief. Some had lost a parent, a spouse, a child. The trauma of that day would follow them for years, an invisible weight they carried long after the news crews had packed up and left. The first church of Odessa, once a place of solace and peace, had become something else entirely. What was once sacred was now stained with memories of terror, its very walls a reminder of the violence that had shattered so many lives in the blink of an eye. For those who survived, the church would never be the same. It was no longer just a place of faith, but a place where they had come face to face with death, and where the scars, both seen and unseen, would never fully heal. Seth Ader wasn't an unknown figure to law enforcement. His past was marked by instability, run ins with authorities, erratic behavior, and clear signs of mental distress. He had been flagged before, yet nothing in his history suggested that he was capable of the kind of devastation he would bring upon Odessa. His brushes with the law were numerous, but relatively minor traffic violations, disorderly conduct, moments where his anger flared out of control. But none of these incidents hinted at the unspeakable violence he was about to unleash. Friends and family saw Ader's deterioration over time. He was troubled, often angry, with bouts of paranoia that seemed to deepen as the years passed. Some described him as volatile, capable of lashing out, but even those closest to him couldn't explain what had driven him to this extreme. There were no clear signs of radicalization, no manifesto, no clear vendetta against any particular group or individual. The massacre he carried out seemed to have no specific target, just a desire to spread pain and chaos. The question of motive became the center of the investigation. Why Odessa? Why that church? Why those people? Investigators dug into his past, looking for answers, but even now, many parts of the puzzle remain unanswered. Was it a personal grudge? A breakdown that had spiraled out of control? Or was it simply the result of a disturbed mind unraveling? The answers died with Ader, leaving the city of Odessa to grapple with an act of terror that seemed as senseless as it was brutal. The hours of terror finally reached their climax as law enforcement closed in on Seth Ader near a movie theater on the outskirts of Odessa. After a frantic day of bloodshed, it was here that the hunt would come to an end. The once bustling streets surrounding the theater had become eerily empty, cleared by the urgency of the police chase. Patrol cars screeched to a halt, and officers took position, knowing that Ader was armed and dangerous. A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant hum of helicopters and the faint sound of sirens. Then, like a spark igniting a firestorm, bullets began to fly. Ader, cornered but still defiant, opened fire on the officers who had surrounded him. His rifle, the same weapon that had claimed so many lives that day, was now aimed at the very people trying to stop him. The shootout was fierce and swift. Law enforcement responded with everything they had, determined to bring the nightmare to an end. Ader, bent on destruction until his final moments, continued to pull the trigger, each shot a final act of defiance. But his reign of terror was about to end. With one final burst of gunfire, Ader was struck down. His body collapsed, lifeless, as the long hours of violence finally came to a close. The streets were quiet again, but the damage had been done. The trail of death and destruction he had left behind could not be undone by his fall. Though Ader was gone, the weight of his actions would linger in Odessa forever. Odessa, a city that had weathered its share of challenges, now found itself facing a tragedy that seemed impossible to comprehend. The violence that tore through the church had spilled onto the streets, leaving innocent civilians as victims, people who had been simply going about their daily routines, unaware that danger had been lurking just around the corner. The toll was staggering, and the pain rippled through the entire community. Memorials began to spring up in Odessa almost immediately, makeshift shrines of flowers, candles, and heartfelt notes left for those whose lives were cut short. The church, once a place of solace, now stood as a reminder of the terror that had swept through its doors. Elsewhere in the city, families grieved for loved ones who had been caught in the crossfire as they ran errands or sat in traffic. But amid the mourning, Odysseus' spirit showed through. The community, shaken but not broken, came together in their grief. Vigils were held, and prayers were shared for the victims and survivors alike. The city, bound by the shared trauma of that terrible day, began the long process of healing, knowing that while they could never forget what happened, they could find strength in their unity and resolve to honor those who were lost. In the wake of the massacre, law enforcement launched an exhaustive investigation to determine how Seth Ader had slipped through the cracks. Every detail of his life was combed through, every misstep and warning sign scrutinized. It wasn't long before they uncovered a critical piece of the puzzle. Ader had failed a background check when attempting to purchase a firearm legally. His history of mental instability had been flagged, and by law, he should have been prevented from obtaining a gun. But that hadn't stopped him. Ader had managed to acquire a rifle through private means, bypassing the safeguards that were meant to prevent individuals like him from gaining access to deadly weapons. This revelation sent shockwaves through the community and beyond, raising urgent questions about the gaps in the system. How had someone so clearly unstable been able to arm himself so easily? And what could be done to prevent it from happening again? The failure of the system ignited a heated national debate. Conversations about gun control, private sales, and mental health reform surged in the aftermath of the massacre. Some demanded stricter background checks and tighter regulations on firearm purchases, while others argued that mental health services needed to be expanded to catch individuals like Ader before they became violent. The massacre in Odessa had become more than just a local tragedy. It was now part of a much larger, bitter debate about the future of gun laws in America. As the dust settled and the initial shock faded, the grief stricken families of the victims were left with an unrelenting need for justice. Mourning wasn't enough for them. They had lost loved ones to senseless violence, and they were determined to ensure that others would not have to endure the same pain. What started as quiet grief soon became a powerful call to action. Many of these families began to speak out, their voices rising in unison as they pushed for change. They demanded stricter background checks, advocating for reforms that would close the loopholes allowing private sales without oversight. To them, the issue wasn't just about guns. It was about the failure of the system that had allowed someone like Seth Ader to fall through the cracks. For these families, justice wasn't just about seeking closure for their personal loss. It was about protecting future generations from facing a similar tragedy. Their efforts sparked petitions, community rallies, and meetings with lawmakers. They were relentless, knowing that honoring the memory of their loved ones meant taking action to prevent such horrors from happening again. Each voice carried the weight of a story: a family member lost, a life cut short, and a future stolen. These families turned their grief into a fight, determined to turn tragedy into change, to transform their pain into a force that might save others. Even with Seth Ader dead, the fear he had unleashed lingered like a dark cloud over Odessa. The randomness of his rampage had left residents questioning their own safety. It wasn't just the scale of the violence that shook them, it was the unsettling thought that there had been no rhyme or reason to his attacks. He had fired at anyone, anywhere, turning ordinary moments into life threatening ones. The randomness made it feel as though no one had been safe, and the question hung heavy in the air: could it happen again? Odessa's residents, once accustomed to the quiet rhythms of their small city, now looked over their shoulders. The sense of security that once made the community feel close knit and safe was shattered. Many struggled to return to their routines, walking to the store, driving to work, haunted by the knowledge that on any given day, chaos could strike out of nowhere. The impact of Ader's violence went beyond the physical scars left on the city. It took an emotional toll that would take much longer to heal. For weeks, even months after the massacre, the people of Odessa wrestled with their new reality. The quiet that returned to the streets wasn't the same as before. It was a quiet laced with unease, a city trying to make sense of its loss, while grappling with the lingering question: how could something so horrific happen in their own backyard? Even after the investigation came to a close, many questions remained shrouded in darkness. Why had Seth Ader chosen that particular day to unleash his rage? Why the church, a place of worship, a sanctuary of peace? What had driven him to such unthinkable violence? These questions loomed over Odessa, haunting not only the survivors and the grieving families, but also the law enforcement officers who had tried to piece together his motive. There was no manifesto, no clear vendetta, no written explanation that could have offered closure to those left in the wake of his destruction. The randomness of the attack only deepened the sense of bewilderment. Was it a final breakdown, a descent into madness that had been slowly building? Or had it been planned, a deliberate decision to strike fear into the heart of the community? These lingering mysteries weighed heavily on those who had survived the ordeal. For the families of the victims, the lack of answers was a constant, agonizing reminder of the senselessness of their loss. They struggled with the notion that they might never know why their loved ones were taken. The absence of a clear motive left the tragedy feeling even more cruel, as they sought to understand how such evil could come seemingly out of nowhere. In the end, some answers would remain forever elusive, locked away with Ader's mind. The unanswered questions became part of Odessa's collective grief, an open wound that time alone could not heal. In the aftermath of the tragedy, the first church of Odessa stood at a crossroads. The place that had once been a symbol of faith and comfort for so many was now steeped in haunting memories. For some congregants, the trauma was too much to bear. Walking through the doors again seemed impossible, their memories forever tainted by the horror they had witnessed within those walls. The sanctuary, once a place of worship, had become a painful reminder of the violence that had invaded their sacred space. But the church leaders, along with the core group of faithful members, knew that in order for the community to heal, they had to reclaim what had been taken from them. The church was more than just a building, it was the heart of their community, a place where people had found strength in one another for generations. To abandon it would be to surrender to the darkness that had briefly consumed it. Slowly, the process of rebuilding began, not just the physical repairs, but the restoration of the church's spirit. The bullet holes were patched, the shattered glass replaced, but it was the emotional scars that required the most care. Pastors and church leaders worked tirelessly to bring people back together, organizing support groups, memorial services, and special gatherings meant to foster healing. They knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with pain, but their faith remained steadfast. Bit by bit, the congregation began to return. The walls of the church, once echoing with terror, started to fill again with the sound of hymns and prayers. Though the memories of that tragic day would never fully fade, the first church of Odessa refused to let its legacy be defined by violence. In its rebirth, it became a symbol of resilience, proof that even in the face of unimaginable loss, a community could come together and find strength in one another, turning tragedy into a testament of faith. The Odessa Church murders would forever be etched in the history of Texas as one of its most shocking mass shootings. But it wasn't just the body count that left a lasting scar, it was the sheer brutality, the senselessness of the violence that stunned the nation. This wasn't an act rooted in ideology or a desire for revenge. It was something far more terrifying, an inexplicable act of madness. The randomness of the attack left people grasping for answers that would never come. Ader's rampage left behind not just a trail of death, but also a lingering sense of unease, a reminder of how quickly peace can turn to chaos. Odessa would never be the same. The city, once marked by its quiet resilience, was now stained by an act of senseless violence. Life resumed its rhythm eventually, but nothing felt normal. The scars, both physical and emotional, were permanent. Families continued to grieve, their pain raw even as the weeks and months passed. Survivors faced the long road of recovery, many of them struggling with trauma that no amount of time could erase. Yet, through the grief and the fear, Odessa showed its true character. The city refused to be defined by the horror it had endured. Its people, grieving, scarred, but strong, found ways to stand together, their resilience becoming a testament to their spirit. In the wake of the Odessa Church murders, more questions were left unanswered than answered. For many, this lack of clear motive made the tragedy even harder to bear. How could such violence be so random, so devoid of reason? For those who lost loved ones, the senselessness of the attack deepened their grief, leaving them searching for meaning where there seemed to be none. But some found purpose in the aftermath. For them, The search for meaning became a way to honor the dead and push forward. Whether it was advocating for stronger gun laws, supporting mental health reforms, or simply coming together as a community to heal, the people of Odessa found ways to ensure that those lost would not be forgotten. In the face of such overwhelming violence, they forged their own path, creating a legacy of resilience, action, and hope, determined to build something meaningful out of the ashes of their grief.